Well, the fight for Alberta's future is heating up amid an active separatist petition plus allegations of foreign interference. We'll have a conversation with Thomas Lukaszuk, founder of the group Forever Canadian. That's next on the Line Alberta podcast. Welcome to the Line Alberta podcast. My name is Rob Breckenridge. Thanks for joining us this week. Our next guest has found himself in the middle of a conversation, not just around petitions, but really ultimately about Alberta's place in Confederation, this country's future. Thomas Lukaszuk, of course, a former progressive conservative MLA and cabinet minister in Alberta, is the founder of Forever Canadian. Forever-Canadian.ca is their website. Thomas, good to have you with us here.
Rob, thank you for having me.
So much to catch up on. I did want to, first of all, just even, with regard to your own petition that you very successfully concluded a few months ago, what is the status of that as you understand it?
I recently spoke with a group of Catholics and I told them that my petition is in purgatory. So they sort of understood it. It is sort of in a legal no man's land because, as you know, the Premier has changed the rules on numerous occasions. So now within the 2 weeks of the next sitting of the legislature, this petition will be dealt with by a UCP, which is the governing party legislative committee. And they can do several things to it. One being encourage the Premier to have a vote in the Alberta legislature, which is my preferred option. Another one is call a referendum on that question, or frankly, do nothing. Because with the new subset of rules, the Premier is waiting for the outcome of the current petition, which is the separatist petition.
Well, we're in the midst of that petition campaign, but I think, there are a number of reasons why maybe it shouldn't got to this point. I mean, your petition was first and succeeded. That should have been the end of it. Well, the Alberta government said we can't have unconstitutional questions on the ballot. The Court of King's Bench came back and said, well, this is unconstitutional, the separatist petition. That could have been the end of it, yet here we are. So what's happened here?
Well, we're adding periods until the other team, wins or at least has a better chance of winning. You're right. The law was very clear on the fact that once my petition reached the required numbers of signatures, and as we almost doubled them, the other party should not be able to even file an application. And then they had a second obstacle that they had an unconstitutional question, but as separatists were running into legal obstacles and barriers, Premier kept removing them ahead of them, and here we are. So they're collecting their signatures. I imagine that they will get the number of signatures that they require, because if I can collect nearly 500,000 signatures in 90 days, I imagine with all the help that they are receiving from government, they can collect 177,000 in 120 days. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. It's rather unclear, but, it's frustrating, especially to the nearly 500,000 Albertans that signed that petition, but really it's causing a lot of damage, because the longer we talk about separatism and the longer there is this big question mark hanging over Alberta, the more damaging it is to our economy, to investment, and to our social fabric. This is all that Albertans are talking about. Media internationally is writing about this. This is causing us a lot of reputational damage, and de facto, it's causing that damage to all of Canada.
Well, I think one of the reasons it's getting so much attention, it's twofold, right? But, the fact that some of these separatist leaders, as has been reported, they've been making these trips to the United States or soliciting or reaching out to U.S. Republican or MAGA officials for assistance. And then on the other side of that, some of these American officials who have been pretty open about talking about the idea of Alberta independence or wanting Alberta to be a part of the United States. Is that kind of what's thrust this to the forefront right now?
Well, that's part of it. There are a number of reasons. First of all, never in the history of our province, as happy or unhappy we were either with Ottawa or other provinces, would they consider separatism from the vantage point of government. Every premier had a clear position on it. Let's fight with Ottawa, well, let's negotiate with Ottawa, but separatism is never a variable. And that has changed, at least in the minds of the separatists. They believe that they have Alberta provincial government on their side. Also, never in the history of our relationship with the United States have we had a president of the United States that interfered with our domestic politics and stoked the fire of separatism. Starting with his comments about Canada as a 51st state, referring to our prime minister as a governor, and now having his top officials meeting with separatists and possibly negotiating grants or loans to assist or aid or abate to those separatists. So those are new variables that we never had to deal with. And the world's watching because all this is happening in the context of what I think Prime Minister Carney described quite accurately in Davos, in a time where our geopolitics are shifting, the balances of power are shifting, relationships are fragile, and new ones are being developed. So this definitely plays into the hand of those who would like to see turmoil within Canada, distracting our federal government from the international stage. This is not doing us as a country any good, for sure.
What's your read on the prime minister? I mean, he seems like he does understand that this is something to be taken seriously. I think the agreement between Alberta and the federal government is a good indication of where there can be productive partnerships. And I think certainly folks here are hoping, at least federalists here, hoping that Ottawa doesn't do anything to inflame the situation right now. But do you think he understands what's at stake here?
Oh, without a doubt, without a doubt. The MOU didn't happen by happenstance. The prime minister understands that the province of Alberta has economic needs, and there is a role, a bigger role that Alberta can play in developing our domestic economy and refocusing Canada within this new structure geopolitically. And I believe that he is very open to that. We are probably seeing the biggest restructuring of our internal economy since World War II. And Alberta can play a massive role in that, but that has to happen in a constructive way. This meeting that recently the Prime Minister called with Danielle Smith and then Premier Eby of British Columbia was another step showing that there could be a positive dialogue. There can be give and take, and this country, Canada is a unique country where provinces have unusual amount of power relevant to the federal government. There is no other country like this in the world. And actually, this sort of dysfunctionality is what makes us so unique, and it actually has worked, and it can work. And in the last few months, we have seen that with Prime Minister Carney and his dialogue that he's having with premiers. But it's very difficult to have a dialogue when you have a segment of Alberta population not interested even in the MOU. You saw the reaction of the UCP party at their convention. I read this as unhappiness with the fact that there is a dialogue. They actually prefer the warfare between Alberta and Ottawa and other provinces. So it is high time for our premier to take a clear position on this issue. And I know that politically, and I've been in politics for many years, politically this may be sacrificing her leadership within her own party, or at least weakening it. But now is the time to take the wellness of Alberta, the country ahead of her own political aspirations, and acknowledge the fact that separatism simply shouldn't be an option. And B, there are mechanisms that are working very well. And Rob, if I may add, one table we always forget about is the First Minister's table, which just took place in Ottawa a couple of days ago. If there are such big issues with other provinces, let's say British Columbia, this is the table where our premier should be raising those issues, challenging those premiers, and challenging them to negotiation. Simply expecting Ottawa to come down and resolve our problems is not rational. and stoking the fire of separatism and squarely blaming it on the former prime minister. You may like him or dislike him, but that's not constructive. It's just simply not going to solve the problem.
It was interesting because, Danielle Smith, and it sounded like there was a fairly productive meeting with Premier Eby and the Prime Minister and Danielle Smith, which I think is promising, is encouraging.
That's
But
right.
it was noteworthy at that news conference. And yes, look, in fairness, the Premier did tell the Americans to sort of stay out of our business. But that's as far as she went, right? She didn't criticize any of these leaders who have been going down to the United States. And for that matter, she really hasn't criticized the whole idea of separation at all. And she says she doesn't want to demonize people, and fair enough, but I think it's easy. Look, we've seen her disagree with other people and criticize other things. She doesn't really want to say anything critical of this movement. Maybe, as you said earlier, she still kind of fears it, doesn't she?
Well, she does, and this is a dynamic that evolved over time. As you know, the merger, as it is called, between the Progressive Conservative Party and Wild Rose wasn't really a merger. It was a takeover by the Wild Rose Party. And Jason Kenney struggled keeping those two factions together, and it became obvious that the Wild Rose, what I would consider the more far right wing of the party, won over. And even Jason Kenney, who in many Albertans' opinions has made a lot of decisions to appease the far right, didn't do enough for them, and that is why they ousted him as a leader of the UCP party. In comes Danielle Smith, knowing that this mechanism is at work, and if she doesn't keep the far right fringe of her UCP party satisfied, they will do exactly the same thing as they did to Jason Kenney. And you can see even already Mr. Jeff Rath clearly indicates that if she doesn't keep the separatist wing happy, they will do exactly to her what they did to Jason Kenney. So it's not her supposition. There actually is a threat from that wing of the party. So the premier right now is trying to walk a tight line between keeping her leadership of the party, hence premiership, and at the same time not coming out as an overt separatist. So she came up with this very strange phrase saying that she believes in sovereign Alberta within United Canada. Any one of us who has a good command of the English language knows that this is simply an oxymoron. You can't have both. But she's hoping that this is going to fly. And I think it served her well for a while. But now that the stakes are much higher, separatists are not happy with that anymore. They want her to overtly come out and become a supporter of separatism, even though she's done everything she possibly could to help them with this petition process and help them force her to have a referendum. But at the same time, she's having a difficult time sitting with all the other premiers side by side and prime minister and say that she's not a separatist. So she's at the end of her rope. And if she doesn't decide what her position on this issue is, others will decide it for her.
Well, it's interesting. And going back to what, Danielle Smith has been saying, there was a poll just recently from Ipsos showing that, roughly about 30% of Albertans might be kind of open or sympathetic to the idea of separation, but really only about half of them are really committed to the idea of leaving Canada. The other half seem to want maybe some kind of different relationship with Ottawa or a little more independence or autonomy. What did you make of that?
Rob, it's interesting because I take the time and I do speak with those who are separatists, particularly during the time when I was collecting signatures on my petition. Yes, there is about 10 to 15% of individuals who simply want out. And as a matter of fact, that's the group that is unhappy with MOUs or any progress or any collaboration because that defeats their purpose. They want to see the collapse of the dialogue between Edmonton and Ottawa. But there is another 15% who are using separatism as a way of manifesting their unhappiness with other issues, and it started with COVID, and there was and some are conservatives who are simply unhappy with the fact that liberals won yet another term. They were not big fans of Justin Trudeau, and so there is a coalition of the unhappy, and some of them actually have valid points and valid concerns. And I think it is incumbent on our prime minister and other premiers to sit down and discuss those issues, because they're not unique to Alberta. Throughout Canada, there is a segment of our population that simply feels disenfranchised, left behind, economically disenfranchised. And we need to address those issues, because it's just not good for our country, for our community, to have people who are simply perpetually unhappy and manifesting their unhappiness by engaging or joining other protests. But in that initial 15%, they feel empowered now, and they always were here to a certain extent in this province. The Western alienation is not new to us, but this time the stars have sort of aligned for them. Starting with COVID, they managed to find each other. That they were latching onto other forms of protest during that time. Now they have a premier that they believe is on their side and is helping them along by changing the rules with petitions. And for our first time in the history of our relationship with the United States, they have a president who's actually willing to meet with them through his administration and possibly even offering them assistance. So they feel that if there ever is going to be time to strike, now is this time to strike. So that's why we see this effort strengthened by all those factors.
You mentioned Jason Kenney, and I think he's been a strong voice in this conversation, arguing against the separatists, taking them on, arguing for United Canada. I think probably on most other issues, maybe you and him wouldn't see eye to eye. What do you make of his emergence in this debate, and have you had any conversations with him?
I haven't had any, but I have to tell you, yes, it's not a secret that Mr. Kenney and I were at odds on many issues when he was a premier, and frankly, when he was a cabinet minister in Ottawa and I was a cabinet minister in Edmonton.
Right.
But on this front, I have to tell you, I am very happy with Jason Kenney. I agree with most of his comments, and when we're dealing with issues of national security and that are existential to the future, not only of our province or our country, I will work with anybody, and that includes Mr. Jason Kenney. The only comment I can make about Jason Kenney is the fact that his introduction of the Citizens Initiative Act, which was designed to appease those far-right members of his party during COVID, I don't think he ever anticipated that it would be used this way for this purpose during for separatism. But you know what, that's done, that's behind us, so there's no point discussing that. It can't be undone. So now I welcome strong voices of all Canadians. One of the beautiful things about Forever Canadian, that it is truly nonpartisan. We have individuals who are the original forefathers of the Reform Party, and we have liberals, and we have NDPers. And Mr. Jason Kenney falls into somewhere in between all that as well.
Yeah. I did also want to touch on it. This gets back to the court ruling that we had late last year, because, there's this whole issue of First Nations and treaty rights. And the separatists, I think, kind of dance around this, but this is a serious issue. And we've seen First Nations actively raising those concerns, and they're pushing back on this, perhaps through the courts. And I know you've had a conversation to speak with some of these First Nations leaders. What are those concerns?
First Nations, and first of all, I should not be and could not possibly give justice to the arguments of First Nations. They obviously are more than capable to argue their own case. But I can summarize it to you. They are in a very difficult position because, as far as they're concerned, separation simply cannot happen. Those treaties cannot be broken, and they cannot be renegotiated. Hence, they find it really difficult to participate in a process that should not be happening in the first place. So they don't want to legitimize it by participating in it, because that would imply that they actually believe that this process has a place. But nonetheless, the support of First Nations for our movement, for Forever Canadian, and for unity as a whole is unquestionable. They're proud Canadians, and they expect their treaties to be respected. And First Nations and separatists simply don't speak to the intricacies that would be involved in undoing the treaties if they possibly can be done. Rob, one of the problems that I'm finding when I'm chatting with separatists and trying to learn why they feel the way they do is a lot of them, unfortunately, are putting a lot of faith in what they are hearing from the leadership of Alberta Prosperity Project and all the other allied groups. It's faith-based. They actually believe those individuals. They believe that they are well learned. They're lawyers and doctors. They travel to Washington and meet with Trump's officials, so they must know what they're talking about. But when you actually ask those followers, how are you going to address some of the most simple things? And let me relay a story onto you from yesterday. I spoke with a grain farmer, and he wants to separate. And I said, I'm going to ask you some questions. How will you ship your grain out of Alberta? What ports? What trains?
Right.
What highways? What currency and what international trade agreements are you going to rely on? Which agency is going to inspect and certify your grain? Whom are you going to buy next year your crop insurance from? What currency will you use? He thought about it, and then he said, we'll figure it out. Well, maybe we will, but it may take a decade, and I'm not sure if he can survive for 10 years, without farming income. And that is unfortunately the fact that, those who are promoting Dr. Modry and Mr. Rat, frankly, even if this whole exercise collapses and fails, they will do just fine. He can practice law in another province. The other one can practice medicine. Farmers won't be able to pick up their farms and move them somewhere else. People who work on pipelines and refineries won't be able to relocate. So what I'm finding, and it really saddens me, that those who have been convinced are the ones who actually have most at stake, because they are least portable. They don't have the transferable skills that would be required to move to another province and do work in another province. And they stand to lose the most. And yet, for some reason, they put their faith in individuals who cannot answer the simplest of questions, but instead choose to attack anybody who questions their theories of what this independent Alberta would look like, or how great it would be to be the 51st state.
Just back to the issue of First Nations for a second, because what concerns me, I mean, look, we heard First Nations speak out back in the fall when the Alberta government was making these changes. And that's when the Alberta government said, don't worry, we'll make sure that nothing unconstitutional is going to end up on the ballot. And so that was pulled, from the table. The Alberta government walked that back. So here we have a situation where if we want to move forward with a new pipeline project, we're going to need the support, the involvement of First Nations at a time when they're very concerned about all of this. And maybe they've been betrayed somewhat by the Alberta government.
Well, it even goes a little bit further than that, Rob, if I may suggest, because not only did the Premier took the promise that whatever is proposed by separatists will not be unconstitutional, but when the Court of King's Bench, Justice Feasby, and comment needs to be made about Justice Feasby, he is not just any other ordinary justice of the Court of King's Bench. He is a constitutional expert. He was purposely chosen by the Chief Justice of the Court of King's Bench to listen to that, to hear that trial, because he has unique expertise. On top of that, he actually retained two law firms who are known as the Friends of the Court to give him additional constitutional advice. So his decision was well researched and likely would withstand any appeal all the way to Supreme Court of Canada. And he ruled that the question posed by separatists is unconstitutional and violates the treaties. So the Premier has gone further. She actually retroactively changed the law and overruled the decision of the Court of King's Bench, basically nullifying it, and took the power of deciding what is and isn't constitutional into the hands of the Justice Minister within her own government.
All right. It's interesting as we talk about the economic side of all of this. I know last year there was an analysis by Trevor Toome at the University of Calgary, I think really laid out where the separatist case is lacking and where there's some real economic holes in their argument. Even just recently now, we've had the Alberta Chambers of Commerce come out and say, all of this uncertainty is creating economic uncertainty. And, the threat of separation poses all kinds of economic challenges for Alberta. There is that worry out there. And do you think that's starting to resonate with people?
Well, it is. And very recently, we heard from very prominent businesswoman, Miss Nancy Southern, the owner and CEO of ATCO, one of the biggest homegrown companies, that she is starting to feel a pension investment as a result of this conversation about separatism. Rob, we all know that business and investors are looking for a good return on investment, but also stability, and even sometimes they will take a cut on return if there is a stability. Alberta at this point in time, unfortunately, cannot be considered as a stable jurisdiction to invest in, because we none of us, even those of us living over here, have no idea what the future holds. All economists agree that the hit that Quebec took during their separatism flirtation was between 5 and 7% of their economic growth. That's not just in 1 year. That's perpetual. That carries on.
Right.
So it is, those of us who either travel or lived outside of Canada, during those days, if you asked anyone to mention one city in Canada, Montreal would have been that city. It was the business and cultural capital of Canada. But during that time, it was Bank of Montreal that left for Toronto, Royal Bank, Sun Life Insurance. Hundreds of thousands of Quebecers moved. And look at Quebec, and particularly Montreal right now. It is no longer the business center of Canada. And that is the reason why, and they have never recovered since. So we can't afford to take a perpetual 5 to 7% hit. And I also spoke with Dr. Trevor Tom, and he and his colleagues, and this is not partisan because it is peer reviewed by economists, from across the ideological spectrum. They all believe that the damage that would be caused to Alberta just through this ongoing flirtation with separatism would be between 5 to 7% of our economic growth on an ongoing basis.
So let's talk about the pivot now. Forever Canadian, as mentioned, originally was this petition campaign to sort of beat the separatists to the punch. And we've talked about everything that's brought us to this point. So what is Forever Canadian now evolving into? What's next for the organization?
So pivot is a good point. So now we are mobilizing our volunteers, and our volunteers will have a very complex but rather simple to instruct task. We will have to identify, and on referendum day, bring out to vote all Canadians living in Alberta who are supportive of Alberta staying in Canada. So identifying the vote, bringing out the vote on referendum day, but at the same time, we're hoping to provide those who still haven't made up their minds, or those who I would consider to be soft separatists, with factual, unbiased information from numerous sources. So that is why I mentioned I spoke with Dr. Trevor Tom, and we're speaking with other experts, not only within Alberta, but nationally and internationally, to provide every Albertan with the facts, verifiable facts that they need to make probably this most important decision in their life relevant to voting. This will be probably the most important vote that Albertans have ever participated in. And going back to Justice Feasby, he was very clear when he was rendering his decision, and it's part of his decision, that just saying, "Don't worry, First Nations, we'll take care of you," is not the answer. Albertans, including First Nations, when they vote for separation or for staying in Canada, have to have a very clear understanding of what the consequences of that vote is or are. And that is why it is very important that those who are simply thinking of utilizing voting for separation as a means of sending another message of dissatisfaction to Ottawa, that is not a responsible way of voting, because the consequences are irreversible. And we saw this with Brexit. Rob, in Brexit, it was quite interesting. Actually, it's quite analogous. Up until the vote, all pollsters agreed that support for Brexit was only about 30%. And yet, during the vote, they got 52%. But interestingly enough, after the vote, it went back again to 30%, which means 20% of Brits voted for Brexit because they were simply unhappy with something else and now regretting it and hoping to get back into European Union. But it may be irreversible and too costly to go through that process twice. We don't want to do that to ourselves.
Well, you also don't want Federalists to be complacent. And I think, one of the encouraging things about the Forever Canadian petition was just to show how motivated people are to keep this country together. That's an encouraging sign. Look, we don't know when or how this referendum is going to happen. Maybe it'll be in conjunction with an election, maybe some other referendum questions. But that's really important, isn't it? Making sure people don't take anything for granted.
Well, we can't, and we're very aware of this. People who are reasonably satisfied, we see this during every election, tend not to participate in elections at the rate that those who are unhappy, right? Those who are unhappy are motivated, and doesn't matter who's playing hockey that night or what the weather is like, they will come out and vote. So Forever Canadians challenge will be to share information with all Albertans and implore upon Albertans how important, how critical this vote is. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose in elections, sometimes you get the government you voted for, sometimes you didn't. But there is no way back. We're Canadians, and if we lose that citizenship, if the process of separating from Canada begins, you're looking at selling houses at a depreciated market because everybody will be selling houses at the same time. You're looking at relocation to other provinces if you or your loved ones are employed by federal government. These are things that we actually never conceptualized. This is sort of not throwing a coin up and see, if it lands heads or tails. This is irreversible. This is existential. And also it will weaken the rest of Canada. As I mentioned earlier, there are players in the world right now, some just south of us, who are looking at cracks within Canada that could possibly be exploited for economic gain. This is not the time to be embroiling ourselves in domestic disputes when the world is dangerous enough as it is.
Indeed. Well, we'll see what the next few weeks and months bring us. Much more is mentioned, forevercanadian.ca. Thomas Lukaszuk, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's forever-canadian.ca.
Right.
And our only call, Rob, now as part of identifying supporters is we're asking all Albertans to register themselves on forever-canadian.ca so that we can communicate and organize this campaign.
That'll do it for this episode of the Line Alberta podcast. My name is Rob Breckenridge. Much more at readtheline.ca. And we'll talk to you next week. Take care.